Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 6, Thomas Hobbes. Let us have introduction about the unit. Thomas Hobbes is one of the most colorful, controversial, and important figures in the history of Western political thought. In his lifetime, he was almost unanimously denounced for his alleged atheism, blasphemy, and impiety, and was known as the monster of Malmesbury. He was despised by the parliamentarian whom he opposed, and suspected by the royalists whom he purported to support, because his ideas were quite out of step both with the parliamentarian theory of popular representation and the stuttered theory of political legitimation based on the divine right of kings. His status as a great philosopher and political thinker was not fully recognized until the 19th century. The philosophical radicalism of the English utilitarian and the scientific rationalism of the French encyclopedist incorporated in a large measure of Hobbes. Mechanical materialism, his nominalism, radical individualism, and psychological egoism. Emphasizing his influence on the utilitarian thought, Sir Frederick Pollock picturesquely remarks that the formula of the greatest good of the greatest number was made as a hook to be put in the nostrils of Leviathan, so that it could be tamed and harnessed to the chariot of utility. By the mid 20th century, Hobbes was acclaimed as probably the greatest writer on political philosophy that the English speaking people have produced. According to Michael Oakeshott, the Leviathan is the greatest, perhaps the sole masterpiece of political philosophy in the English language. Hobbes is not now generally regarded as the father of modern political science. It is he who, for the first time, systematically expounded the absolutist theory of sovereignty and originated the positivist theory of law, which was perfected by the analytical jurists of the 19th and 20th centuries. Though he was by no means a liberal, modern commentators believe that his political doctrine has greater affinities with the liberalism of the 20th century than his authoritarian theory would initially suggest. From the Marxist point of view, Hobbes' theory is seen to reflect the political ideology of the incipient capitalist market society characterized by the doctrine of possessive individualism and the ethics of cutthroat competition and self aggrandizement. Karl Marx himself is said to have remarked that Hobbes was the father of us all, and it is the measure of the richness and suggestiveness of Hobbes' system of ideas that it is supposed to imply or assume. One of the most sophisticated modern methodological tools of mathematical analysis for an adequate explanation of social phenomena. John Rawls thinks that Hobbes' state of nature is the classical example of prisoner's dilemma of game theoretic analysis, and writes like Hampton, Kafka, and Gatherer have examined Hobbes' theory in the light of the above remark, though a full-fledged application of the prisoner's dilemma analysis to Hobbes' theory of the state of nature has hardly been successfully attempted or achieved, because Hobbes' theory is perhaps not amenable to that kind of analytical treatment. From a broad philosophical perspective, the importance of Hobbes is perhaps in his bold and almost systematic attempt to assimilate the science of man and civil society to a thoroughly modern mathematical physical science, corresponding to a completely mechanistic conception of nature. His psychological egoism, his ethical relativism, and his political absolutism are all supposed to follow logically from the assumptions or principles underlying the physical world, which primarily consist of matter and motion, or rather, matter in motion. Whether a state may progress from geometry to physics and then from physics to politics, psychology, and ethics is possible is another matter. It is, however, mainly a deductive system derived from materialistic premises that Hobbes understood his philosophical enterprise, and this is how generalizations of Hobbes scholars have interpreted him ever since. Here it is pertinent to make two observations. First, it should not be understood that Hobbes is the precursor of the modern empirical science of politics and sociology, which regards the methods of physical science as the proper model for political in the Mill's sense. Hobbes was strongly opposed to Bacon's empirical and experimental method. His own method was deductive and geometrical through and through. It was the resolutive compositive method as developed in the school of Padua and followed by Galileo and other natural scientists. The second point to note is that, in spite of Hobbes' claim about the utility of his thought and its foundation in scientific materialism, modern scholars have neither endorsed the supposed utility of his philosophy nor accepted the scientific basis of his ethical and political theory. Leo Strauss, taking a cue from Croom Robertson and also relying on Hobbes' own observation that a knowledge of natural philosophy is not a necessary precondition for understanding his views on politics, argued that his political theory was pre scientific and was based on humanistic premises. According to Michael Oxford, the basis of Hobbes' politics was not scientific materialism but philosophic rationalism, not a specific view of nature of the world, but a particular notion of philosophical knowledge. This line of thought culminated in the famous Tyler Warrender's thesis, which completely separated Hobbes' mechanistic psychology from his deontological ethics. While Tyler found in Hobbes a proto-Kantian philosopher of duty for duty's sake, Warrender placed Hobbes squarely in the natural law tradition based on theistic metaphysics, deriving the obligatory force of law from divine command. F. C. Hood likewise argued for the divine politics of Hobbes. There is a lot of textual evidence to support the theories of Tyler, Warrender, and Hood. The point, however, is whether it is reasonable to jettison Hobbes' psychological egoism, which is an important element of his theory, in order to make Hobbes a consistent deontologist as depicted by these writers. Are we justified in making Hobbes more consistent than he really was, and in this process ignoring the historical and contextual basis of his writings? Quentin Skinner has forcefully argued that none of the Hobbes contemporaries understood Hobbes as grounding political obligation on the prior obligation to obey the command of God, and that this is a conclusive proof that the Tyler Warrender Hood interpretation is erroneous and misleading extrapolation. A review of existing critical literature and a close textual analysis of Hobbes' writings show that it is not possible to reconcile these conflicting interpretations and neatly fit them into a coherent philosophical system. But logical consistency is not the sole mark of a philosopher's greatness. The profound richness of the intellectual context of a philosophy may be a vibrant source of inspiration, opening different avenues of thought, and it may far outweigh the lack of logical rigor and formal consistency. It is a true measure of Hobbes' greatness as a thinker that so many important and suggestive ideas and perspectives of thought are adumbrated and found interwoven in his comprehensive, though complex and multifaceted system of philosophy. It is true that Hobbes' extremely pessimistic and unedifying view of human nature is not only highly distorted and exaggerated, but incompatible with the very idea of a civil society. But it is also a fact that, as one perceptive writer puts it, such a lurid and extreme possible picture of the human condition appears to be a magnificent incarnation of an eternally recurrent form of error that in some time and places looks disconcertingly like the truth. Let us discuss Hobbes' life and times. Hobbes was prematurely born in 1588 in Westport near the small town of Malmesbury in England in a, at a time when the country was threatened by the impending attack of the Spanish Armada. He died in 1679. His long life was full of momentous events and synchronized with great scientific discoveries and philosophical systematization characteristic of the century of the genius. Hobbes was a witness to a great political and constitutional turmoil caused by the English Civil War, and his life and writings bear clear imprint of it, though the philosophical import of his work went far beyond the controversies of his time. After his education at Oxford, where he was rather bored by the teaching of Aristotle and the scholastic philosophy, Hobbes joined as tutor to the son of William Cavendish, first Earl of Devonshire, in 1608. He remained closely connected with the Cavendish family for a long period of his life. He accompanied his charge to France and Italy in 1610 and came under the influence of Kepler and Galileo. After his return from the continent, he remained with the Cavendish family for the next 18 years, dividing his time between London and Chatsworth, the country home of the Cavendish. Hobbes' next visit to France was in 1929, when he accepted tutorship to the son of the Sir Gervase Clinton, after the death of his first patron, the second Earl of the Devonshire, in 1628. In the year 1628, Hobbes' translation of Thayer's History of the Grecian War was published. During his second visit to the continent, Hobbes came under the spell of geometrical method and started from self-evident premises and proceeded to derive complicated theorems by way of logical deduction. During the third journey to France and Italy, 1634 to 37, which he undertook with the third Earl of Devonshire, whose service he had rejoined in 1631, Hobbes met Descartes, Gassendi, and Galileo. He became convinced that everything, including man and society, moral and politics, could be explained on the basis of laws of motion. Kepler's law of planetary motion and Galileo's laws of falling bodies made a deep impact in his mind. He returned to England and completed in 1640 his first important philosophical work called The Element of Law, which was published in 1650 in two parts, Human Nature and De Corpore Politico. In his work, Hobbes demonstrated the need for undivided sovereignty, but the arguments for this were not derived from the theory of divine right of kings. In 1640, Hobbes fled to the continent in fear of his life after the dissolution of Parliament in May 1640 and the impeachment of Earl of Stafford by the Long Parliament. For the next 11 years, he remained in Paris in the intellectual circle of Maricin. During this period, he accepted to act as tutor in mathematics to the future Charles II. The exile in France was the most fruitful period of Hobbes' intellectual life. In 1642, he published his De Civic in Latin. He also planned to write his ambitious trilogy on body, man, and citizen, in which everything in the world of nature and man could be explained on the pattern of the science of mechanics. He made a beginning with De Corpore Leviathan. Hobbes' magnum opus was written during this period and was published in 1651. Clarendon thought that the book was written to flatter Cromwell. Hobbes himself is reported to have said, "I have a mind to return home," but the philosophical sweep of Leviathan was much about the intermediate political controversies of the day and had far-reaching consequences for the future development of European thought. Hobbes returned to England in 1951 and was soon embroiled in a controversy with John Bramhall, Bishop of Derry, on the question of free will and determinism. Another controversy was with the mathematician John Wallis about Hobbes' attempt to scare the circle. In 1957, De Homine, the second part of his trilogy, was published. The last year of Hobbes' life were devoted to the writing of his autobiography in Latin, both in prose and verse, and a verse translation of the Iliad and Odyssey. Hobbes died at Chatsworth in 1679 at the age of 91. Leviathan is Hobbes' most famous work. It is, however, not the only important source for a complete understanding of Hobbes' ideas. Many competent scholars believe that although as literature, De Cave does not rival Leviathan, which is a masterpiece of English prose style, it is superior to it as philosophy. A. E. Tyler, in his interpretation of Hobbes, relies mostly on De Cave. This is not to say that there is any fundamental discrepancy between Leviathan and other works of Hobbes. There is only a difference in emphasis and style of presentation. The argument is substantially the same. Different books are devoted to illuminating the basic theme in different ways. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.